hand it over to you.
Yep, whatever you prefer.
Sure. Well, thanks, Tom, for organizing these wonderful events, and thanks to all of you for attending. My name is Gerasimus Tsourapas, and I will speak for a bit about what we've been doing at the School of Government in terms of decolonizing the curriculum, and I'll try to tell you a bit about what we've done and the model that we've adopted over the last few years about promoting this agenda and making it as successful as possible. And then I'll hand it off to the wonderful Richard North, who's the head of department at POLSIS, the Political Science and International Studies Department, who will talk a bit more about specific actions within POLSIS as that relates to BAME students. So we'll talk about this in more detail. I'll start us off by saying that this has been on our agenda for a number of years. I came in at the School of Government as the ED&I lead back into 2018. And the Decolonizing the Curriculum agenda was part of this from the beginning. We, I think, had to face three challenges here. And you might be surprised to know that it wasn't really resistance from, potential resistance from our colleagues that I was mindful of at the time. I think the first challenge that we faced in implementing this agenda had to do with making it as inclusive as possible. So from the very beginning, we were conscious of the need to avoid making the decolonizing agenda something that was seen by colleagues as a top-down exercise, something that was managerial in manner with little actual effect for students and for colleagues across the School of Government. So we wanted to find a way to ensure that as many people participate in this as possible, and that it really becomes an inclusive bottom-up project rather than something that we did on a one-off basis and then moved on. And this is linked to a second challenge, which is really embedding the Decolonizing the Curriculum project into a wider set of actions. So I think all of you agree that a minimal understanding of what this means, which would be something like changing one's reading list or ensuring that we engage with certain debates, is not really what this agenda is about. We saw it from the beginning as something much more ambitious than this. So we aim to embed this into a wider set of ED&I actions in order to make it work and in order to inspire people to join in. And I think the third and final issue or challenge that we faced, at least for me, was to make its impact obvious, make it measurable. So if we were able to convince students and colleagues to join us and to participate in this project, we also had to convince those higher up to also follow along. And one of the ways to do this would be to find ways to make the impact of what we were doing visible, to be able to quote unquote measure what we're doing and show that it can be done in a relatively small amount of time. The way we started off is by getting the entire school together back in late 2018. So we had a wonderful away day organized solely on the theme of decolonizing the curriculum. And that was attended by colleagues and by PhD students from POLSIS, from development, across the three departments, really. And it was organized by us, who invited Dr. Meera Sabaratnam from SOAS, University of London. Meera, of course, leading this both at SOAS as well as nationally. So she came in and sat with us for about half a day and talked with us about what decolonizing actually means, why we should be doing this, and how to do this as well. So that started a lot of discussions within departments and within individual colleagues in terms of how to move forward. So a lot of us took different parts from that discussion. For me, as EDI lead, one of the things that I pressed for after that was finding ways to promote unconscious bias training. And indeed, we made that, we made training on unconscious bias mandatory for all members of staff at the School of Government as one way to get colleagues to think about these processes a bit more. Laura Jenkins, who's not with us today, but is another wonderful colleague at Pulses, took from this the desire to go back and look at how we're teaching what we're teaching. And what she did was engage in a curriculum health check, as she had called it back in the day, where she actually went through our entire offering of modules for Pulses and examine them against a set number of criteria in terms of whether they talk about race at all, whether they talk about sexuality, whether they talk about colonialism, and to what extent do they ask students who take this module to engage with scholars that might be situated outside the global north, quote unquote. That was a monumental task that she did, and she did a fantastic job there. And that created, that actually opened up a bit of a black box and allowed us to understand that there is something to be done there, that there is a lot of things that we could be doing. We continued with debate across departmental away days and across departmental meetings. So we placed EDI as a standing item in those meetings and in the away days, again, as a way to introduce as many colleagues as possible to this and to sort of answer any questions that anybody might have, or sort of try to tackle any objections early on to discuss them as much as possible. I introduced an EDI survey for the entire school that has been running now for 3 years, and that has allowed us two things. Firstly, it allowed colleagues and students to voice their support or their complaints about this process in an anonymous fashion, to complement, in other words, what is happening at away days and at departmental meetings. And also, very importantly, it allows us to sort of track our progress over time, to track any shifts in how colleagues understand the EDI agenda, how they understand decolonizing the curriculum, and sort of measure this. Going back to my original point about trying to make this something measurable in terms of its impact. What we found, of course, and I can talk about this at Q&A, and of course Richard can pitch in as well, is that the resistance, of course, to this agenda was very limited, but it was vocal. So there was a few, there were a few colleagues that did object to the decolonizing the curriculum model or agenda as it was put forward. My sense is that a number of them did so firstly because it impacted their own work. So my understanding of this is that if we had to do it again, perhaps we could stress the fact that this is not something that is aimed at increasing colleagues' workloads straight away or at all. This is something that is much broader than this. And of course, there are a handful of people that still not see the importance of or relevance of this agenda. And the way we tackled it, and Richard, feel free to correct me later on if you think that otherwise, is that we discussed this as much as possible. So we did not try to prevent anybody from voicing any concerns. We did not sort of do this in a very single-handed fashion, but we aimed to discuss individually with people and help us understand their objection and help them understand why we're doing what we're doing. The thing that helped me a lot was the fact that this was happening at the same time as we were preparing a reapplication for Athena Swan, the project on protecting gender and promoting questions of gender in UK academia. The fact that Athena Swan did care very much about such matters helped. It allowed us to embed questions of decolonizing the curriculum within the Athena Swan structure, and it gave us an added impetus to continue on with this agenda, I think. So that was quite helpful. The next step was to look at the design of our individual programs, and this was led by Richard, to think about how we're teaching what we're teaching at the UG level in terms of the 3 programs that Pulses puts forth: international relations, politics, and political economy, and to try to look at instances in which this can be improved and instances in which the lessons from the Decolonizing the Curriculum agenda can be implemented in terms of new modules or revisions on modules, or perhaps discussions with individual colleagues about what they're teaching within specific modules. And that was, to a great extent, quite successful, particularly if we look at how students reacted to this. And Richard will attest to this in a second. The last point I wanted to make was a bit of a pitch about the last stage where we are in terms of this process. It is important to note that we see it as a process that doesn't really end. So this comes up again and again in our discussions of this not really being a finite project in which we achieve something and then we just let it go. So as we thought about ways to continue this this agenda within the school, about 6 or 7 of us got together and collected our thoughts. Really, I tasked everybody with writing perhaps 500, 600 words on how they understand the Decolonizing the Curriculum agenda and how that has impacted their teaching. So we collected all of this material within a short document, and we added a number of things that we thought we might ourselves find useful if we had to do this again. So we had a brief history of this project nationally and internationally. We had some FAQs about how to do this and where to look for help. We included all sorts of readings that people can refer to if they want to learn more about it, as well as a brief list of contacts that people can reach out to if they wanted help. And this has been rather well received. This is now at the inclusive educator part of the HEFI Canvas course. So you're more than welcome to take a look and send me any feedback. But this is where we stand right now. So we saw this from the beginning as an inclusive exercise, and we continue to do this. And we hope that as time goes on, then the lessons that we've learned, but also the importance of this project is diffused across the wider school and hopefully through the wider college. Finally, the important thing that I haven't talked about is also the key contribution that students have had on this agenda and how they contributed to what we're doing. And this is why it's important to have Richard here, and he can talk a bit about how the student experience and student voices have featured into all of this. But I'll stop here and let him speak, and I'm really happy to hear any questions or discuss any of these points further. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Yasmus, and particularly thanks for going first because I was a bit late getting here. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. There is something strange, but probably all too familiar about two middle-aged white men talking about decolonization and BAME. And as Yasmus indicates, this is not simply a staff-led effort. I don't think it's entirely inappropriate because we are the cause of many problems, or we are in positions where we can help resolve problems. And I think to leave this simply to students or to people who are affected by some of these issues will be to abdicate responsibility. And I think Erasmus has done a remarkable job in leading on much of the work that's been done over the last couple of years at school. However, what I want to do is speak on behalf of some of the students who've been doing an extraordinary amount of work. I did offer to share a platform with the students, but they were a little bit shy, but it is really nice to see a number of Pulse's students here in the audience. And I'm going to give a shout out to one of them. Well, two actually. Hema for taking over. Actually, I'm going to keep going. Actually, Hema's just taken over the society that I'm about to talk about. But returning also is Fatima, who I'm going to talk about a lot more. Fatima just graduated from Pulse's, is now doing important things in government, so secret that we can't possibly talk about them. But she's also been responsible for a huge amount of work that we've done over the last year. So I'm really delighted that she found time to come back and join us, and hopefully we'll hear from her a bit later. So my starting point on this was as head of department, I get given data from time to time, and every now and then I seek data out. And what became clear to me, and it shouldn't have really taken very long, was that there is a significant BAME attainment gap in pulses, as there is in the university and across the sector. And when you really dig into that data, you see that attainment gap is pretty horrifying. I mean, some years it's well over 25%. More students are getting first if they're white compared to if they're BAME. But when you dig down into that data, you find actually there are some students that do far worse. So particularly Afro-Caribbean students are doing considerably worse. So the statistics, if anything, underplay some of the problems there. I don't think any responsible head of department could not look at that and ask, okay, what can we do about it? And my answer to that was to talk to our student engagement officer, Kerry Myers, who does a remarkable job across a whole range of issues with the school. And we decided, okay, well, we're not really sure what to do. And we're not necessarily sure we have the answers, even if we think, well, long and hard. So let's ask the students, let's get them all together. And so we just speculatively sent an email out and said, you know, we'd like to launch a BAME society. It's a terrible name, but please come along and have a chat with us. And so I think it's on a horrible wet Tuesday afternoon in the Muirhead Tower, and life doesn't get much grimmer than that. We were amazed to see 45 odd students turn up and sit down and talk to us. And we had a really wonderful meeting where they talked to one another, they talked to us, and they wrote lots of stuff down. And two things immediately came at the fore was that how many BAME students we have in pulses. I think one thing that was said over and over again was, I didn't realize there were this many students like me in pulses. And when we looked at the data, we turned out there's 200 plus. But this wasn't being recognized either by us or by BAME students. And the second thing that became clear was that people were experiencing the same issues over and over again. That what one person was thinking they were experiencing on their own turned out that a lot of other people were experiencing the same. So there were an awful lot of commonalities. And so what we did after that was we met every week. Every week we got together and we talked about issues and we shared experiences. I talked a lot too much, as is my want, but I also, I hope, listened as well. And I certainly felt I learned a lot. And a large number of things came out of this group and are continuing to come out of this group. The first thing is students took control and renamed it Pulses in Colour, which is a much better name. And that's now going forward under Hemma's leadership. She's taken over leading the committee, and which various others, including Max Sood and Sundas and Ebony, who are also all here today, are leading on. Now, over the last year, apart from meeting weekly and kind of reflecting on a number of the issues and trying to resolve quickly where we could find solutions, we did a number of things which may not in themselves necessarily sound amazing, but I think were important and addressed some of the issues, which I'll come to in a second. It's one, we had some social events. It sounds okay, so well, we have social events all the time. And we spent the GDP of several countries on pizza, and that was money well spent. And we debate nights were organised, and discussions as a games night. These in themselves were just a nice thing to do on one level, but I think they're extraordinarily important on another level in creating a community, that we had students coming together, sharing problems, identifying with one another, and creating a home for themselves in the university department. And I'll explain in a minute why I think that is so important. They then would storm ideas and come back with suggestions for things we could do at later events. So I think these events are informal ways of sharing experience and bringing people together were very, very important. We also tried to look at careers and internships. We didn't make as much progress there as I hoped, because eventually we were knocked off course by COVID and the lockdown. But we had started working with a group called Caribbean Elective, who put together internships where students can go and work in the Caribbean, and there's a politics stream for that, which works in government. And we were just putting together funding for that, and we were trying to organise careers talks, and we will hopefully come back to that. But again, one of the issues that we found students were addressing is that BAME students were often not networked in the same way, or not taking advantage of as many opportunities as other students. And again, I'll come to the reasons for that. A third thing we're doing, and Ebony, who's here, may want to say something about this a bit later, is we're looking at how students could contribute directly to the curriculum. Many students have been critical of our curriculum, and justifiably so. One interesting thing we can do is ask students to help write modules with us, and Ebony's started doing this with Charlotte Galpin. Again, it's been knocked a bit off course by the lockdown and just the sheer pressure we're all under at the moment, but this is something that I was actually talking to Charlotte about today, and how we can pick this up again. So there's been an awful lot of stuff going on, and I met with Hema and a number of other students last week about what we're going to be doing this term, in terms of, can we bring in some interesting speakers? What sort of events can we do? And it's so much more difficult with everything under Zoom, but we intend to keep this going and to recruit first years. But what I want to talk about, maybe just for 5 minutes or so, is the biggest piece of work that we took this year. And I say we, I really do mean Fatima, who's here, and another student. I don't think she's here, but Rameza Mahmood, who stayed on to do a master's with us this year, but was a finalist last year. They undertook a very large survey of Pulse's students to find out a lot more about the BAME experience and how it differs from white students' experience. And to say that that work is impressive is an understatement. I've actually got the document here. It even has a nice front page. But this is the BAME student experience in Pulses. And this was started in the spring, where Fatima and Rameza started to draw up survey questions. They talked to Erasmus and got some good advice and guidance there, and Kerry and Charlotte and myself. But this is almost entirely a student-led and student undertaken piece of work. I mean, it really is deeply impressive, and it ran for months, and right through into August, they were still writing up this report. They'd graduated, they had no reason to do this other than they wanted to present something to the department. And it's an eye-opening and deeply impressive piece of work that we intend to repeat year on year to try and see what progress we're making, but also try and uncover problems in the department that we need to resolve. Now, I can't possibly do justice to this report. It's something that we've started to circulate, and I'll be happy to share it with anybody here who, if you want to contact me for a copy. But let me just try and give you an idea of the scope of this. They came up with 23 questions, but within that, there were lots of sub-questions that followed on, depending on how you answered. There was quantitative and qualitative data produced. The report itself is 35 odd pages plus a series, several pages of recommendations. 208 students responded to the survey, with 116 answering every single question, which, given the detail and length of it, is no small achievement on anybody's part. And of those, 54 students were BAME with impulses. Now, that overrepresents BAME students in some way, but we expected that and encouraged it. I think about Pulses has about 25% BAME students. Now, like I said, there's so much come out of this report, and I can't even say that I've digested it fully. But I just want to touch on maybe three things that, and I've organized this slightly differently from how Fatima and Rameza did, just to make it a little bit more digestible for current purposes. But it really only scratches the surface of what's going on. But there were three broad issues that I thought they drew attention to that we might want to think about and reflect on further, both as a department, but I really think as a university community. The first thing they draw attention to is the extent to which racism continues to be prevalent on and off campus, and how this affects BAME students. And this can be anything from ignorant comments in seminars, looks, what are sometimes called microaggressions, right through to full-on abuse, insults, in one case, violence. And sometimes this is off campus, sometimes this is on campus. But in one sense, the distinction doesn't matter, because it generates a burden that students are carrying, and which we as a department and as a university need to be far more aware of. It's not enough for us to simply say, well, these comments ought not to happen in seminars or lectures. It's a recognizing that people carry baggage with them wherever they go, and that affects how well they can do in life, and in our case, in the university. It's really hard to capture the extent of these in this survey, But what worried me more was perhaps our response to it and how students felt they could get support with this. So one issue that came up straight away was a lack of understanding about how racist comments or racist incidents could be reported to the university or to the department. There was no obvious complaints procedure that mapped out what a student should do if this happens. And this put the burden on students to email speculatively the head of department, which they felt deeply uncomfortable doing, or raising it with a member of staff who might be grading their work. And so all too often students didn't know what to do. And so there's a feeling of impotence in the face of this, and therefore the burden had to be held and maybe at most shared with friends or family. Even when it was felt that one knew what to do, there was also a lack of willingness to report incidents. Part of this, it was reported there was people feeling uncomfortable talking to non-BAME staff. There's a feeling that white staff would not take complaints seriously, that they could not relate to the issues that were being raised, wouldn't understand the seriousness of it, particularly if the insult or the comment was subtle, or it was. Oh, sorry. For some reason, my phone keeps switching on. Siri thinks I'm talking to her, apparently, which I'm not. I'm not sure I understand. Sorry, I'm just going to switch. I can't switch it off, sorry, so I'm relying on my Bluetooth to stay online, so excuse my phone. So there was a feeling sense that staff weren't relatable or weren't going to be empathetic or sympathetic in the right ways, in the ways that were needed. There's also more worrying a fear that this would just be an issue that was brushed under the carpet, that it was too difficult or complex to deal with, that somehow the department wouldn't take it seriously, that the department wasn't committed to dealing with racist incidents or microaggressions, that there's a fear that perhaps talking to someone who's going to mark your work might come back to haunt you at a later stage, that you might be, in a sense, be penalized in some way, or that ultimately the department doesn't have the will to deal with these things. Either it doesn't know how to, or it doesn't really want to because it's difficult and complicated and would rather just avoid the issue. And there's an awful lot of data to support that, statistics about how students feel about this. I won't go into those, muddy the waters a bit, but the evidence, I have to say, was overwhelming that students were feeling this. And the result was that students carry this burden of feeling attacked or insulted or marginalized at times, and not feeling that institutional department or members of staff are either willing or available to help support students with this. The second issue I'd like to look at is just the educational experience. And this is within pulses, but it wouldn't be illogical to think that this could be shared more, this could be generalized across university and across other universities. And this is really what the narrative that came out of the, again, very rich data that Fatima and Rameza brought together was a feeling of exclusion and lower expectations. That with the exclusion, it felt that students weren't necessarily confronting a curriculum and a set of modules that spoke to them. Again, these aren't modules that reflect their lived experiences, that they don't see themselves reflected back in the material that we're teaching and talking about. At the same time, there was a feeling that they weren't encouraged to participate in seminars, that BAME students might be the only one in the room, so feel that they're standing out and are different in some way. That many of the topics we talk about, particularly in politics and international relations seminars, are not topics that make students feel uncomfortable, and staff aren't working at ways to make students all feel included and comfortable. And so particularly when issues to do with race, Islam, or terrorism come up, students variously reported saying, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to be the representative of my people or my race. I don't want to be put on the spotlight like that. Or I don't want to be seen as a person wearing hijab who therefore is a sympathizer to terrorism. And these were the kind of comments that were coming back and making it difficult for students to feel that they were able to participate in seminars on an equal footing. Similarly, students reported feeling less comfortable in approaching academic staff to discuss their work, to go to office hours, to get support for their assignments, and similarly had slightly lower willingness to get feedback on essays. And again, we can put this down to feelings of exclusion or not quite fitting, which I'll come back to in a moment. More worryingly, oh no, actually not more worrying, equally as worryingly, is the feeling that staff had lower expectations of students. some of this we might say was internalized feelings that students had come with, feeling that they weren't expected to do as well, and that nothing that staff did changed that feeling. But also there's much more concrete ideas. So one stat that really stood out was that well over 70% of white students said they'd been encouraged to do a master's or spoken about it, but BAME students reported that only 37% of them had been encouraged or asked if they wanted to do a master's. And so there's a general feeling here that there was a lower expectation on the performance, either as speaking out in class, going on to do advanced study, or just performing to the same level as other students. Now, the one aspect that came out of the education thing was the extent to which a lot of this was reporting subjective feelings. These feelings were real and they have real causes, but it was remarkable to me that students are saying, I feel I'm the only BAME student, therefore I stand out, or I feel that this particular topic makes me feel awkward. And there was very little about the objective obstacles that BAME students face. And this really came out when Fatima and Rameza asked students about the BAME attainment gap. And very few seem to recognize it. And this came up with a question when students said, do you feel you're as likely to get a first as any other student? And the answer was yes. But we know objectively that stats show that that is not the case. And this is a structural problem, not an individual problem. And the structural impediments and obstacles were being experienced as personal failures or personal feelings about not being able to progress and to flourish in the same way, rather than necessarily feeling that this is actually an obstacle that students are facing outside of themselves, and which we are in large part responsible for, both within the university and outside. Now, bringing all this together, how I interpreted the work that our students did was, and I'm going to kind of use a Hegelian term here because that's just where I come from, is a sense that BAME students don't feel at home in the university in the way that white students do, or not to the same degree. There's a lack of belonging and recognition there, which is inhibiting performance in a way that's not easy to characterize and is not always tangible, but has very real effects. And we see this by students commenting that there is a lack of diversity by staff. They're taught by people that look like me, okay, old and white, bald and boring, and all these sort of things. And that means that you're not seeing role models, or you're not seeing yourself reflected by the department. You're seeing that this is not for people like me, is how I understood. There is a lack of recognition being reflected back. That our curricula and the texts we read, the things we talk about, don't speak to the interest and experience and history of Black and Asian students in the way that we ought to. And so again, there's a metaphorical exclusion and a lack of reflecting people's identity. We see this in seminar rooms where there's a very visible distinction between one set of students and another. And it's compounded by occasionally racist or ignorant comments or insensitive comments by staff. I remember one student very pointedly saying to me that I daren't speak out or object about some of his comments because I felt I'd be characterized as a cliched, angry Black woman. And I had no idea that students were like this. But it is a fundamental problem. And it goes wider beyond the department. Students talk about not feeling at home in the university, having imposter syndrome, that they don't look exactly the same as their students, or they don't feel like they belong here. A lot of BAME students reported feeling the need to work harder than other students to get to the same place as white students, that they weren't taken seriously by other staff or by other students. I mean, the reporting rates were quite staggering on that. And it's also reflected in an unwillingness to participate in extracurricular groups. If we exclude, say, the Afro-Caribbean Society, the participation in guild societies was lower. And the participation in Pulses Society, the Politics Society, is far, far lower. And part of that's to do with the drinking culture and a sense of not belonging. So this really doesn't even come close to scratching the surface of what our students have done and achieved in writing this report, and the work that others, Ebony and Maksud and Sundas, the HEMA, have been doing all over the last year. But I think what it does demonstrate categorically, and in the words of the students, rather than us projecting our thoughts on that, is that there is a fundamental problem with the attainment participation rates and of BAME students. And part of this is in large part because of the burden that they're carrying due to failures in institutional sensitivity towards their needs and interests. There are a huge number of recommendations that students put forward, which we will get to, but rather than me continue to talk, I think it'd probably be better if I stop now and give somebody else a platform. So thank you.
Wow, that was really really interesting set of reflections from both of you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think we're definitely going to have to see if we can get a copy of that report to have a look through that. For those of you in the audience who are watching, if you've got any questions or comments or reflections, there should be a Q&A button that you can use at the bottom that will enable you to ask some questions, or there's a kind of chat function in there as well. Let's go through my bank of questions here. Sorry. So Richard, you talked a lot about the setting up of this the society as being in many ways like a catalyst for some of this work. How did you kind of go about approaching starting that up? Was that as simple as an email, or yeah, how did it start?
Yeah, it was pretty much that simple. I'd reflected on the data. I realized we had a problem. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't think it was something that we could ignore. So I just literally got the student email list, and I just wrote to the entire student body and said, if this interests you, turn up on a wet Tuesday afternoon, and we'll bring some cake along, and we'll take it from there. And there was no clear plan to start with. There was just a sense that we ought to do something, and it was then taken over by students who really led on this, and we facilitated and supported where we could, but this was a student-led initiative in the end.
Excellent, thank you. We've just had a question through for Rasmus, and it says, it's great to hear about the changes you made to what you teach, but were there any changes made to how you teach?
Gosh, that's a great question, actually. How you teach is particularly important, and it really is actually, at the end of the day, it's probably even more important than what you teach, I suppose. So the method through which we try to inform our students pedagogically matters quite a lot. So there was a period, speaking personally, right? So there was a period of self-reflection in the sense of what kind of assumptions do we make for the students that are part of our lectures and our seminars. So where do they come from? What kind of backgrounds might they share? So how do we present certain material to them is quite important. So I teach Middle East politics. So I'll give you an example of this. I've been, over the last few years, particularly mindful of how to teach challenging topics like the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? So this becomes important in the sense of being balanced, but also making sure that you give space and mental capacity to students to raise their own voice, to raise what they're feeling. So we've had a number of students of Arab descent, for instance, who had really vocal views about this, and understandably so. So it's very much about making sure that nobody feels marginalized. So making sure what Richard said back a bit ago, making sure that they're not seen as representatives of whatever group that we tend to put them in, that we take them at their face value, but we also make space to hear them. So I think how I engage with students, and this has come out from other modules as well, has been particularly important in terms of just tempering our own teaching styles and sort of confronting the biases that we might have coming into the classroom that are frequently, quite unconscious. I don't know if, Richard, you want to add anything on how teaching has changed, perhaps, at Pulses.
No, I think it's a more general problem. I mean, we we struggle with it. I think, you know, it's not just a BAME student issue at all. I mean, there are all sorts of different groups of students, whether it's based on class or sexuality, just confidence. It's something that I think we probably can't resolve on our own. It is a lot that we can do in terms of talking about different ways of doing things, about, for example, changing the way we do lectures, making them much more interactive. And that's just a general problem when you have someone talking at you for an hour. I mean, that's appalling. And so the things that will benefit all students, but where students are excluded, I think probably the best way of doing that is probably in conversation with those students. I don't think we can always presume to have the answers or that there are quick fixes. And I think diversifying the way we teach, that people trying different things is the best way. But I think most of all, listening to our students and giving them a forum in which they can respond to us and say, okay, look, this isn't working to us for these reasons, is probably the best starting point.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in now. One of them is, the report you mentioned talked about microaggressions and the impact that was having on students. How can an institution effectively deal with incidents of microaggressions, do you feel?
It can do different things. I mean, first of all, it can listen. That when people report insults or feeling marginalized or offended, these aren't things that should be dismissed quickly. Just because they're subtle or hard to articulate doesn't mean they aren't real. So I think listening to those that report them and making sure that they have the opportunities to report them is one important thing. The second thing is making everybody aware of the impact of what they say. A lot of the things that come to me as head of department, occasionally you hear appalling things which are just out of court, but more often than not, it's ignorance or insensitivity that's the issue. Often there's not intent in a comment, but it's just a lack of thought or a lack of feeling about how this might impact somebody who's on the receiving end of it, either because they're constantly hearing the same thing or because they're perceiving it differently because of where they stand. And so there's an educative element to it as well. All of this has to be balanced against free speech, and which is something Yerasimos and I hear a lot in the department. And there is a sense that we have to be open to discuss all issues, sensitive, complex, contentious issues. But it's about setting the parameters like you would in any conversation and making clear what the expectations are in terms of being respectful towards one another. That some people will have different levels of sensitivity towards issues. Some people are just more sensitive than others, and that's not a bad thing. That's just how it is, and we need to be aware of that when we speak. So I think it's a whole range of little things. I don't think there's any one silver bullet to this. If there were, we'd have shot it a long time ago.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But I think there's definitely some useful points out of what you've just said there. So thank you. Another question we've had through is considering the intersectional experiences of Black and ethnic minority students, such as Black female students feeling concerned about misogynoir or the angry Black woman trope, did any considerations of the experiences of LGBTQ+ minority ethnic students arise from the research or discussions that have been going on so far?
I'm going to just answer very briefly. I'm going to pass to Yerasimos because there is a different group that Yerasimos has been involved with. But no, for the most part, that didn't come up in our discussions. It was actually the issues that tended to come up were commuter issues or class issues a lot of the time. But one point did come up, which I won't say who said this, but one person said, I thought it was a very nice analogy between the two experiences. So someone said that I came out as lesbian, and until I did, I felt that in every classroom that I sat in, that someone was looking at me, was judging me, was knowing that I wasn't straight. And this preoccupied me, that when I was on campus, I felt different and I felt awkward and I couldn't perform because of that. I felt like I was carrying a big burden on my back all the time that was occupying my mind and I couldn't give full attention to my studies. And a BAME student who was listening to that said, that's exactly how I feel about this. And so I don't know if I've got any comments beyond that, but it does seem that there are some sort of parallels in the challenges that are facing different students with different issues. And of course, there are important distinctions and differences to make, but it does seem there are parallels there which are responsible for students not participating dropping out or achieving less than they might otherwise do in better circumstances. But I mean, Erasmus might have something to add to this.
I would just quickly say that we were conscious about this very issue from the very beginning, and this is why we put forth an application and secured some money to create an LGBTQ society at the School of Government that brings together staff and professional services staff, academic staff, professional services staff, and students as well. So to be honest with you, the issue that we have there is that a lot of people still feel uncomfortable sort of, coming out, talking about these issues publicly. At least we haven't seen this explicitly in the surveys that we've conducted. Yet we know that it's there. Anecdotally, we know that there's still issues that need to be confronted. So our approach to this was to try to create safe spaces through this society, through the events. So we had an oral poetry event with Travis Alabanza last year, for instance, that was really well attended. And it showed the extent to which students want to engage with these voices. So we're still at an early stage, but I think what we need to overcome right now is overcome this sort of fear from students and perhaps some of the staff as well to talk about these issues openly. And then once this happens, then we'll put forth more actions about tackling this in the long run.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions, I presume, from colleagues elsewhere in the University of Birmingham who have asked if you've done any work with other departments to kind of share the kind of experience or knowledge of kind of what you've been working on in the School of Government.
I would say in terms of the school, so we've put forth, part of why we produced this 35-page document is to share it across the university. So our plan is now, I talked to Hefi, and Hefi has been quite interested to create a micro CPD session to talk about this, which is made freely available to all staff across the university. We've added it to the Hefi Inclusive Educator Canvas page. And we're doing an event later on this semester at the College of Social Sciences. So ultimately, my hope is that next year, once things settle down a bit more, and we actually have a bit of breathing space, that we'll do a much broader event that brings in people from outside the university, but also from across the college. So whoever this is, I think it was anonymous. If you're interested in this and you can send me an email, I'm happy to add you to the people I let know about this. But there is stuff happening already, absolutely.
Fantastic. We've had another question about, so the report talked as well about Black and BAME staff and kind of the role that has in all of this as well. Is there any work going on that you can talk to around trying to redress that locally?
Yes and no. I mean, in one sense, we're losing staff rather than gaining staff right now, so we're not going in the right direction, and there is a bit of a freeze on recruitment, but it's something we're extremely sensitive to because it's not just students have raised it, but staff have raised it. In terms of what we're doing, or at least when we're able to recruit again, there are things. We did spend quite a bit of time rewriting all our adverts to make sure they were much more appealing, not just to BAME staff, but also to women. We don't have enough female members of staff in the department. And so we've made it a real priority that any adverts we put out for posts that we are really encouraging applications from their staff. The other thing is looking at the areas in which we recruit to. Our department has been a very traditional department, mainly really quite obsessed with tanks, bombs, bullets, Cold War, and this kind of stuff, which has always attracted a certain kind of middle-aged white male to the department. It's that subject. And so one of the things we're looking at, and this links up with what we teach as well, is the areas to which we recruit. So the kind of areas we're very interested in recruiting to are, African politics, Indian politics is a big gap in the department, Latin American politics. But also, we did have an advert ready to go before COVID hit and shut things down, but looking at issues of race and multiculturalism as well, which is, so it's often that there are gaps in our curriculum which, were we to advertise, would much more likely improve things. We have also been talking to HR about the extent to which we can show priority to BAME applicants. This is a complex issue. There are certain legal restrictions on what can be done, but my understanding is now that this is a consideration that we can take into account. So I wouldn't say it's outright positive discrimination, but in a sense, a tie between candidates, it's now a factor that we can take into account, and that wasn't so before. So it's something that we're deeply insensitive about, and it's very noticeable when we meet as a department of staff that, well, I see myself reflected back, but there are 3 or 4 members of staff in the department who don't, and I don't think there's anybody in the department who's not wanting to diversify that. Unfortunately, it is both a very slow process, given that the speed of recruitment, I mean, we're talking, if we're lucky, 1 person a year may come in as we change, but also academia generally is dominated by white faces. As you get to master's level, it gets whiter, at doctoral level more so, which means that the applicants tend to be male and white. Typically, there'd be no more than 1/3 of applicants are female. Depending on the subject area, a small minority will be BAME. So it's a much bigger structural issue that we're dealing with, not just what we can do, but like with all educational aspects that affect students, there's a lot happening before students get to university and beyond, which we have no control over.
Yeah, so this kind of relates to a question that we've had around how you can show the diversity of, like, for lack of a better word, like BAME history, aside from colonialism in the curriculum, is a big part of the kind of barriers for that at the moment around having the correct expertise, like in terms of staff.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we are trying to address it where we can. So, for example, we brought on a module this year called Rising Powers, which allows us to bring in some Latin American work. We will be working with IDD, who have launched an undergraduate program to get African studies in, because they have experts there. But it is actually just a lot of problems of expertise. I used to teach more on multiculturalism, but I'm head of department, so I can't do as much teaching. So often it's either availability of staff or just a lack of expertise. And the turnover is so slow that it takes a long time to address this. But I mean, Erasmus has been doing a lot of work with staff about this, and talking to IR colleagues about how they can make sure we discuss different parts of the globe, whether it's by using case studies or focusing on different institutions. I mean, he'll be able to say more about that. I'm not an IR scholar, but we're also doing it, say, in my area in political theory, that we're trying to look at different issues to make sure that we're actually not going to the same old tropes and examples that we normally would, that we can show that what we're talking about actually has a very different component that ought to be considered and hasn't been for too long.
I mean, if I can just step in very quickly, I'm teaching, for instance, IR theory this year, which is a postgraduate course. And one of the things we're doing is embedding voices from the global south into the curriculum. So it's of course, we are talking about colonialism and post-colonial theories in international relations, but we also seek to do something a bit deeper than that, which is to get students to engage with voices from outside Europe and North America, not just people, for instance, like Edward Said, but also sort of key women, African scholars that have come in and sort of taken all these theories that we take at face value typically, but criticize them and show us how they may be Eurocentric, how they may not apply to the global context, like very interesting things like this. So I think there's more to this than colonialism, absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. Another question we've had, presumably from a student, is what's the best way to counter a narrative to a topic in class without offending the teacher and potentially affecting my grade?
I'll pick this up very fast because I see it in our sort of work. I don't expect teachers to be offended if you try to provide a counter narrative, and I think actually that will help your grade rather than diminish it. I think that shows critical thinking, and it shows also a degree to which you're happy to go against the flow and argue against certain things that we may be taking for granted. In which case, I would say please raise these points because we need them. If you're still uncomfortable, I would say one way to do this would be to go back, do a bit of reading, look up your syllabus, take a look at other work in the library or online, and try to embed your feelings about this into a specific counter theory. So for instance, what I just said about Edward Said, if something like the Clash of Civilizations theory strikes you as kind of problematic, what Samuel Huntington was talking about of Europe versus Islam and all this, take a look online and raise the point from the perspective of somebody like Edward Said and say, well, a post-colonial thinker would actually disagree with this. What is your take on this? And I don't think any academic worth their grain would actually disagree, and actually they would value such points.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you. We've just had another question through that says, we're having issues with not just the university-wide implementation of EDI training, especially for senior level staff, but also the application of this training in everyday incidences of race-based risk aversion, microaggressions, etc. It seems they think the two things are disconnected. How have you found you've encountered similar issues, and have you had and have you any experience of decolonizing these staff?
What a great question. I'll give you my 2 cents because this is something we're struggling with as well. So I wish I could say, here's the answer to how do you do this, but we really don't have the answer. We see this as a sign for the need for a broader cultural change within the departments, schools, and colleges. So I think it's going to take much more time than just saying that this is mandatory. What we've done practically, if you're looking for some sort of practical advice, is we talk to the head of school about whether things like this can pop up in people's PDR forms, for instance, on annual evaluations. We now, at the School of Government, our annual PDR forms have a box that say, well, have you done your unconscious bias training lately? Have you replenished this? Have you done the EDI training? So again, this is not really perfect. And even if somebody goes through the training, that doesn't really mean that everything is automatically fixed. But we're looking constantly for ways to embed these discussions within everyday things across the school. It's going to take some time, but there's already a bit of change, I think, at the senior level, and I think Richard agrees with that. So that's our incremental sort of approach to questions like this.
Oh, I think so. I mean, we've had pushback in pulses in departmental meetings, and I think there are different things that you can do. I mean, I'm relatively skeptical of the value of training because it normally persuades those who are already persuaded and fails to persuade those who don't want to be persuaded. There are different tactics. I actually think sometimes talking less about it is more effective. You just keep doing it and you don't keep raising a red rag to a bull that is not willing to engage. You generalize the issues. That often an issue about race is also a similar issue to about sexuality, and it can just be presented as an issue of inclusion more generally. And you move it onto ground which is less immediately contentious for some people, but which they can buy into in different ways. And we don't always have to worry about their reasons for doing something. Sometimes we just want them to do it. But most of all, I think it's persistence. It's about normalizing a conversation, because what we're doing here is changing minds and changing a culture. You don't do that overnight. You don't present a report and expect people to just respond to it. That's not how folk function. But like all things, I mean, one weird example is smoking. Go back 20 years, lots of people smoked. It wasn't a problem to do it indoors. Now, it'd be scandal if somebody had a cigarette. It's a very fast shift in terms of how we perceive what was a very ingrained habit. And you can see this with all sorts of different attitudes towards gay folk. The kind of things you've heard at one point as casual jokes on television are just beyond the pale. And we can see that happening recently with issues of race and with Black Lives Matter. And so I think continually talking about things in non-confrontational, general ways can be just as effective, because you start to change the culture and what is the normal reference point for people until it just becomes expected and normal.
I think that is an excellent place for us to leave this on. Thank you both so much for being so generous with your time. And
sorry, Tom, can I do one very quick shout out? Someone said, asked, how do they join Pulses in Colour? If you contact either me or Hema Chopra, who is here and there, we'll help you get joined up.
Sorry, yes, I did see that question. I actually sent them the Instagram link for Pulses in Colour, because that seems to be where they're the most active. But yes, thank you both so much for being so generous with your time. Again, a massive shout out to those in the audience who've been involved in Pulses in Colour. It seems like you've been doing some really great work. Yeah, so thank you all. And I think that's where we'll leave it now. If you are joining us for our next session, it is at past, and we're talking about community organising with Citizens UK. But yeah, that's everything. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.